All right. Welcome back to Last Second Sports, where we are giving you our take down to the last second. It's your boy Jesse here for another 49er video. And in today's video, I want to do something completely different than what we have done so far with the channel. I want to try to project the 49ers in 2022, and I want to do so by comparing them to a team of the past from the NFL. So, I've been actually thinking about this for quite some time, and I'm curious to see what your thoughts are. So make sure that you comment what your thoughts are, if you agree with me, if you disagree with me, or if you have a team that you think from the past NFL that fits this upcoming 49er team better than the team that I'm suggesting. But some of the teams that I looked at and thought were very, very similar to the 49ers would have actually been a 49er team from the past, 2012 49ers. They were reworking that offensive line. They had transitioned from Smith to Kaepernick. They were coming off of an NFC championship game. There were a lot of similarities with that team, but that is not the team that I chose. And another team that I thought had a lot of similarities with the San Francisco 49ers was the 2005 Pittsburgh Steelers. Ben Roethlisberger was in year two. Willie Parker was in year two. Very, very good defense. That team also went on to win the Super Bowl. But to me, those teams, although we're close, were not as good of a match as the team that I'm going to give you. And not just because I feel like the team is a better match, but the landscape of the NFL at the time was a better match. And the team that I'm going to propose to you today is the 2018 Kansas City Chiefs. So before we get into the team itself and where their similarities are, let's talk about the landscape of the NFL. In 2018, the AFC was the conference that lacked quarterback talent, and it seemed like most of the talent was in the NFC. Much like when we look at the NFC now, it is quote unquote lacking quarterback talent, and the AFC has the talent when it comes to quarterbacks. Now, I'm going to read you some of these names, and you're going to say, well, I mean, that guy's terrible. What are you talking about? But you got to remember, this is going into 2018. So, not even after 2018, but going into 2018, a lot of these names were good quarterbacks or perceived to be good quarterbacks, players that were on the rise, what have you. So you got to put yourself in that mindset versus today's mindset and what we know about some of these guys. But back then, so remember, we're flip-flopping conferences. The NFC today is the AFC then, and the NFC then would be the AFC today. But let's look at the quarterbacks in the NFC going into 2018. We had Drew Brees, Eli Manning, Jared Goff, Carson Wentz, Aaron Rodgers, Dak Prescott, Russell Wilson, Matt Stafford, Cam Newton, Matt Ryan, Kirk Cousins. I mean, just stacked in the NFC. Much like the AFC is today, or is perceived to be today. Now, this is what's really interesting. The AFC then versus the NFC now is so similar. Extremely similar. Very top heavy with three veteran quarterbacks. The AFC had Ben Roethlisberger, Phillip Rivers, Tom Brady, much like today's NFC has Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady, Matt Stafford. There was a quarterback who was young, but also kind of established as pretty dang good, and Derek Carr, much like we see Dak Prescott today. And then we had the young gun who had already shown that he had a ton of skill. That was Andrew Luck. The NFC has Kyler Murray. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. Going into 2018, two young stud quarterbacks who were relatively unproven. Patrick Mahomes had only played a game his rookie year. Deshaun Watson had started like 6 or 7 games, but we didn't know what these guys were going to be just yet, right? Just like we see today with Trey Lance making only a couple starts and Justin Fields in the NFC also, who played more than Trey Lance, but shows a lot of promise, tons of athleticism, what have you. So the landscape of the quarterback position was so similar back in 2018, just opposite conferences to what we actually see today, which then brings us to the team itself. Well, Patrick Mahomes, much like Trey Lance, was going into year two. We didn't know a lot about him. He went absolutely crazy that year. And I think if Trey Lance does anything close to what Patrick Mahomes did in year two, 49er fans would be ecstatic. Well, they also, just like the 49ers, had a running back who was going into year two in Kareem Hunt. Now, let's look at the wide receiver and tight end positions. Well, they had Travis Kelce, who was 29 at the time, a little bit older than George Kittle, but very, very good player. Had come off of a couple good years with Alex Smith. We knew that he was one of the better tight ends in the league, just like we know George Kittle to be. But when you look at the wide receiver position, they had a bona fide game breaking talent at the wide receiver position and Tyreek Hill, just like the 49ers have in Deebo Samuel. And then they had Watkins, who had played on Buffalo prior, but had shown flashes, looked like he could be a promising number 2 wide receiver, just like we think of Brandon Ayuk. And then here's where it gets even more similar. They had a wide receiver who had only had a couple years in the NFL. I think he had 3 years, so a little bit older than Jennings, but either way, big body guy, sure-handed receiver was the third option there when it came to the receivers, and Chris Conley. Now, when we look at the offensive line, a lot of similarities there as well. Much like the 49ers, we know who the left and right tackle are. They're established players at those positions, but the interior of the offensive line was a major question mark. In fact, I believe that they reworked the left guard, the center, and the right guard from the previous year. So a little bit more than what the 49ers had to go through, but that's what they were dealing with headed into that 2018 season. And then when we get to the defense, more similarities. They had a up and coming stud in Chris Jones, just like the 49ers have in Bosa. They had D Ford. Well, the 49ers have D Ford technically right now, although D Ford was very, very different at that time. And then even crazier, when you look at that secondary and the similarities that it has with the 49ers, first of all, they had Kendall Fuller and Steven Nelson, which, I mean, pretty damn good players at that time, younger players, but the 49ers seem to have a pretty good starting secondary as well. But when you get into the safety position, this is where it gets even more interesting. They had Eric Murray, who was taking over at one of the safety spots, relatively unknown, had a couple years in the league, was only 24 years old, much like either a Moore or a Hufanga would be. An even stranger, Ron Parker. Not a name that a lot of people outside of Kansas City would know, right? Which is what I feel a lot about Jimmy Ward. A lot of people don't know who Jimmy Ward really is, but we know how good he is for this team. Well, Ron Parker was pretty damn good for that Kansas City Chiefs team as well. And in fact, a lot like Jimmy Ward in year 4 had transitioned from DB to safety. At this time, he was 31 years old, holding down that other safety spot, much like we see with Ward today. I think Ward's 30, I could be mistaken, but right around the same age, year 4 transition from corner to safety. Just a lot of similarities between these two teams. Then when we get into the head coach, even more similarities because Andy Reid, an offensive genius, much like Shanahan, was going into year 6 with the Kansas City Chiefs, just like we see with Kyle Shanahan. So to me, the team that I found in NFL history that most resembled, at least on paper, based off of the landscape of the NFL at the time and the landscape of that team at the time, would be the 2018 Kansas City Chiefs. So 2 questions for you, and go ahead and add these answers in the comment section. But question number one is, if the 49ers had a similar season to that 2018 Kansas City Chiefs team, would you be satisfied? I personally would be satisfied based off of Patrick Mahomes, well, Trey Lance for us, having a phenomenal season, showing that he is here to stay and is going to be a stud in this league for a long time to come, and falling just short of getting to a Super Bowl. That would be disappointing, but at the same time, I think the future would be very bright, and I would be extremely happy with the outcome that the Kansas City Chiefs ultimately had in 2018 when you look at the quarterback position and where they fell short. So for me, I would be extremely happy. And then the next question would be, how close am I, right? Out of all the teams in NFL history, is there a team that you feel like resembles this 49er team more than the 2018 Kansas City Chiefs? I'm very, very curious to see who that is, why that is. So make sure you comment down in the comment section. As always, appreciate you. Love you. Have a fantastic weekend. Peace.